forces in the Translation Project Selection Committee. Thank you. I'm a member of the Translation Project Selection Committee, and I'm also involved in the Contemporary Art Committee Japan. At the Art Project Art Platform Japan project, we have been involved in completing the translation project, and it began as a 5-year project, and it will be concluding in March. And here in this session, we're going to be looking back at how the foundations of all the projects that we have been involved in as Art Platform Japan have been promoting is part of what we already saw discussed in session 1. And in session 2, we're going to be looking at the 2 publications which have been translated. These 2, first of all, History of Japanese Art After 1945. This is a translation of what was published in 2014. Kitazawa Noriaki and Kitazawa Sato Doshin, and a total of 25 contributors were involved. From 1945 until the 2010s, the teens, these chapters are the ones which have been translated on this occasion. We're very happy to be able to welcome one of the contributors, Professor Mitsuda Yuri, to this session, and the other publication is Towards a History of Anti-Art in Performance, and this is also a massive tome. The author is Kuroda Raiji, and he has very kindly joined us today. And as Odate-san has already mentioned, this project began in 2014, and from the very beginning, we had decided upon translating Toward a History of Anti-Art Performance, or rather, the anarchism of the body, and correction. And this is also the discussion about the need for an overview. And we decided also to translate the other book, which is the overview, History of Japanese Art. They are going to be published by Leuven University Press. History of Japanese Art After 1945, His Institutions, Discourses and Practices will be the English title for the history of Japanese contemporary and modern art. And Anarchy of the Body is the correct English title of the other book. The electronic versions have already been made available, and you can already purchase them from the Leuven University Press website. These also involved with the issues relating to the tasks that we need to resolve with, that we need to come to grips with, and also about the issues relating to the preparation of translations. Until 5:05, we're going to be having a discussion with Nakajima Izumi of Osaka University, and from 5:20, after a break, we're going to be having a discussion with Dr. Yamamoto, who's lecturer at Kanazawa Institute of Technology, and Odate Natsuko, who are going to be having a discussion with Kuroda Raiji. So I'd like to start by having Nakajima-san introduce Mitsuda-san. Thank you. I am a member of the translation project. My name is Nakajima, and I'd like to begin by giving you a brief introduction to Mitsuda-san and the book which has been translated. As for Mitsuda-san's work, I think you all need no introduction. Professor Mitsuda is a graduate of University of Kyoto. She worked at Kyoto Toyama and also Shoto, and continue to be active as a curator. And she is now a professor at Tama Art University. And Professor Mitsuda has been a highly renowned curator and also is known for her academic contributions relating to 20th century Japanese art history, also history of photography, particularly avant-garde art, and the discourse surrounding contemporary art is another field in which she has made some extremely important work. In 2012, New York MoMA held an exhibition looking at art in Tokyo. She is known for her article, which she contributed there. And Professor Mitsuda is an extremely important key figure in this field and has also been a noteworthy voice in this discourse as well. Chapter 7, or was it 8? Chapter 7 is what Professor Mitsuda was involved with. This is also a very thick book, and it's heavy, but I brought it all the way from Osaka together with the Anarchy of the Body. And we translated 9 chapters, or rather chapters 7 through to 9. But as for chapters 1 through to 6, one of the questions that we asked was what happened to those chapters. But because of the limitations of our budgetary resources, we focused on translating chapters 7 through to 9. There are various reasons why we decided to do that, but one of the reasons for that is that this part of this book really focuses on some of the later developments, more recent developments going up to 2010. However, the book itself, in its full scope, looks at the end of the Edo era, going through to modern, and also all the way up to contemporary art. So the fact that we only, though I really don't want to use that word, we could only provide the translations for chapters 7 to 9 is the full extent of what we are capable of doing. Another thing is that I'd also like to talk about the reason why we chose this book. Part of that is that there's a very strong support for the idea that it would be good to have something which would be the chronological evolution, basic structure or backbone. My personal experience of studying in the United States and the United Kingdom is Japanese art after 1945, Scream Against the Sky, the important text created by Alexandra Monroe in 1994 was a landmark contribution. There's also been major contributions, but the historical perspective was necessary. This was a very strong school of thought in our discussions. And so the institutions, discourses and practice, all those factors which support and which create art is covered in this book. So power, discourse, institutions, the value which is created, which is attached to art, also about formation, the creation of the work, cutting across the different fields would actually make it possible to look at Japanese art in full perspective. And that is the general tenor of the discussion that we and the conclusions we arrived at. Professor Mitsuda wrote about how the contemporary art was established in Japan and how it evolved. So the trauma of the defeat in World War II, how it was received by artists, the accidents and the discussions, the debates which occurred on the way, all that has been analyzed together with institutional analysis and classification. I'd also like to note that the Ishibashi Foundation has provided us with extremely generous and considerate support, and we'd like to make a note of that and also express our gratitude to the foundation at this point. I think I've gone on for long enough, and now I'd like to ask Professor Mitsuda to talk about her own work, her thoughts about this volume, and also have a discussion amongst the three of us and open up discussion to the floor. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Mitsuda Yuri. And this really thick book, History of Japanese Art after 1945, or Nihon no Kingendai Bijutsu, or Bijutsu no Nihon Kingendai Shi. We'd never imagined it was going to be translated, that we'd have that honor and privilege. And listening to session 1 made me aware of the tremendous number of people who are involved. I'd like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude. However, this focuses on modern and contemporary history in Japan, and it is a book that was aiming to trace the evolution from the end of the Edo period, the switch over to modernization, going up to 2010. However, the English version, as Professor Kajiya has explained in the foreword, gives all the reasons why this happened, and you'll be able to understand why this was the end result. As for this book itself, I'd like to talk about the characteristics of this, but now, as self-introduction, if your permission, I'd like to just introduce my background of what I'm involved in right now. This is the Art Archive Center at Tama Art University. We have more than 20 different archives or forms of archives. However, we've only been able to barely manage to create Japanese versions of this archive, and if we could get support from somewhere to put up an English version, we'd be really grateful. What we do is to organize the materials, the archival materials, and also to utilize them. The green shot gives you the academic journal that we published. There's also publication, and we also provide snapshots of what we have in our holdings. However, all of this is being done only for a Japanese language audience. And I think part 1 has really made me aware of that fact. that we only provided in Japanese. It's monolingual. Now, in our Archive Center, there is a material which is identified as the Akayama Kuniharu archive, which really covers a great deal of primary material relating to Jikken Kobo. There's also the Takiguchi Shuzo Bunko, or library, which has a great deal of the archival papers and so forth of Takiguchi Shuzo. And we have sorted, organized, and done an exhibition about Jikken Kobo. Akiyama Kuniharu's archive is not ready for sharing yet, but with the students putting up this exhibition, we have been able to create a list, and we hope to be able to release that. However, archival material is difficult to actually translate titles for, and it's really a long ways until we can actually provide English versions of these titles. However, Jikken Kobo was very much into publishing or printing pamphlets and so on. And here there's a glimpse of some of the important material that you can find in the pamphlets and the brochures that they published. I don't know how the translation is going to proceed, but this kind of primary material or primary sources, if this could also be part of your remit, I dream that this might be something which overseas scholars would find extremely interesting. On a personal note, I'm involved in a study group looking at Bijutsu Hyoshushu from 1955 to 64, and a lot of the exhibition criticisms are involved, but the artist statements, also the self-published pamphlets and booklets, also the kind of group statements that are released are the kinds of material, or the archival material rather, that we covered. And these are very close to the actual artworks, I think. And at the Archive Center, we do have some materials, and though we are nowhere in a position to be able to provide an English translation ourselves right now, I just wanted to share the fact that we do have this material which has not been put into English. Next, web publication. In 2016, which is quite a while ago, there was a symposium at Tama Art University. Professor Kajiya was also one of the panelists. And we invited monoha artists, and the proceedings have been put together, and we have releases which you can look at in the PDF format. And as for monoha, so much work has been done up to now to study them. But what kind of discourse, what kind of photographic material or archive being utilized, we want to look at the difference in the analysis and also on the way in which they will be perceived. We also have the archive of Anzai Shigeo, the photographer. And Tono Yoshiaki, Renaissance, is a topic that we discussed at an art archive symposium last year. Tono Yoshiaki's archive or materials have been donated to us, and we are in the process of sorting and putting them into order and cataloging them. We also have this kind of information available, which is shareable. Thank you for your time. And I wanted to take advantage of this opportunity of how archives are being structured. This is the first time I've worked at an archive center because my past workplaces have always been at museums. So I'm very much a beginner in this field. But archives are so difficult for non-Japanese scholars to access. But what I do urge, and I hope that Japanese scholars will be the first people to look at this, I wanted to share this information, this awareness. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Excuse me? Can you go back? I'm sorry. So this time, this is the index. And next slide, please. Well, excuse me, is this a right order? Well, then please go back. Sorry, go back. Another one. So this book is, as we will soon be discussing about it, this is based on the very special policy to describe history of art. Since I was a student, there was much emphasis on the institutional aspect. So the subtitle is the Institution, Discourse, and the Practice, the subtitle of this book. So we write about the critics, journalism, and then lastly at the work itself. That was the instruction given to the writers to write this book. And I'm not the expert of the institution studies, and Noriaki Kitazawa, Sato Toshin, these are the right people to talk about it. But unfortunately, they are not available today for this meeting. That's why I'm here. I'm just one of the writers, and Kurisawa, who wrote the new chapter, is here in the audience, so maybe can comment on it. Can I talk about it first? Do you want to show the slide? Yeah, I do have slides to show. Why don't we? So, Teiichi Hijikata, the first generation, or rather the first, the chief curator of Kanazawa Museum of Modern Art, which wrote this history of the modern Japanese art. And he studied aesthetics. On that, he speaks about the Japanese modern art, modern fine art, based on what he learned from the Europe. And Ryusei is another book he wrote, and Ryusei Kishida is most exposed or most recognized, or one of the most recognized artists from Japan. So post-war art history was written by our seniors. Do you want me to talk about it? Well, what I wanted to hear from you, Professor Mr., is the what you have shown, and Chiba Ishio's book, I thought was something you're going to talk about it. So the previous works, so these previous works were the basis referred to in your book. So we want you to comment on them. Yes, institution, discourse, and the practice. So institution and the discourse, there much change was introduced before the war and after the war. The post-war art of Japan is the name given. Now we call it Japan's contemporary art. So the name was changed, content was changed, institution was changed. So Japanese art history of 20th century, are we ready to write it? I'm not so sure. And Haryu Ichiro, please go back to Haryu Ichiro. And Haryu Ichiro, this is the one. So it was early enough when it was carried in the Bijutsu Techo. The actually book was published in the 70s, but these articles were written in the 60s from the eyes of the critic who experienced viewing these arts. And these are the items or the titles of each critic. So there are many topics, and each one is very short, very brief. Journalistic eyes Hariuchi had in writing these critics, and not about the any analysis introduced about the work, but rather you can have some idea about the trends of different forces interacting with each other. So this is the book written by Yoshio Chiba, which is the deviation of Japanese contemporary art. So when this was published, it was a surprise to everybody. There was nothing like that before. And in case of Haryu, the description up to the establishment post-war was voluminous, but Chiba started with Gutai movement and not the realism before that, or not the conflictual aspect before that. He started with the Gutai movement and well organized. He belongs to the baby boomers, and therefore he worked with his colleagues, contemporary colleagues, to write it. He visited many museums by seeing all these works, by listening to what the artist had to say. And in Japan, when the artist work, the history is something you need to know, and therefore, for the idea, he felt it was his duty to help support artists so that they can do the work. And this is the first published by Kyoyo Bunko. Difficult to have access for some time in the past, but now they are widely accessible. And everything wrapped 70s, but this book is looking at the Monoha after that. And I was asked to write a comment by Chiba, and in order to study post-war history of art, I studied many books. That's what I wrote. And this is the Noi Sawaragi, Japan's contemporary art title. And It was a lot of reputation. We are contemporary, and since the 90s, the book was written retrospectively, but referring a lot to the deviation of history of Japanese contemporary art by Chiba, and very much close to this idea of institution, discourse, and practice, and much emphasis on the discourse. In other words, not viewing too long each work, but this book is quite interesting to show the approach, unique approach of Asada. This is Shigeo Chiba book by him, who wrote another post-war history of art of Japan, saying that art is not born yet in Japan. And the cover, this is a work by Tanaka Atsuko, and this is more like the how each artist is linked with each other. It's not a history. It's not a history book. Published in after 2000, so about each artist, he's always thinking about what art means. So this is like a book linking different artists. And this is the criticism showing. I'm showing the books of art history in Japan, but to talk about this, what museums did is very important. Museums, what they do, the collection and the exhibition and the research, and due to their work, we started to visualize the history of art post-war. And when did this happen? Originally, it depends on how you look at it. For me, the minor in 50s, 60s, and 70s, for each decade, they did an exhibition for each decade. I come from Kansai, and I moved to Tokyo. You know the right one. That is the exhibition on the arts after 1970, and that's where I started. And the other two exhibition, I didn't see them, but I just bought the catalogs later, and we started to have the mapping of these arts which can be presented to the public in the Tokyo Municipal Museum of Contemporary Art, where you can have a chance to see these. So there was no road available when the road was created by them. And Daiji Kuroda, which will appear after me, his book is about performance art, but performance art does not exist in these books because it's difficult for museums to include performance art, particularly of the naked figures, and therefore the book of Kuroda, that is has significant value because that is the book of arts which could not be shown in the museums of the art.
So this is in the 60s, a transition point of modern art exhibit, and it was quite different from what I thought to be art. And those artists and their works could be known. And for me, this was quite impactful. At the time, if you ask the artists, they say, well, if you line it up like this, you think it's very clean, but that wasn't the case in the 60s, they say. But the actual work is exhibited, and so I think that impact is very big. And then that could lead to people who actually want to do research of this time, and those people will investigate the discourse. And the 70s exhibit, I don't think that took place in the Museum of Modern Art, but it was a photo in contemporary art exhibit. And again, this was quite impactful. At the time, photos, it was a bit outside the world of fine art, but after this time, I think there was more attention placed on photography. And this is an exhibit that I was in charge of. And actually, I'd been working in the smaller art museums. So it wasn't so many artists handled at once, but rather you study one artist quite deeply. And from that perspective, you look at the post-war art. And that was the approach that I had also taken. So each work is collected, and like a constellation, you could create a map within yourself. That's the kind of image that I have. This Taizo Yoshinaka, not many of you know him probably, but he's a friend of Tatsuo Kida, and as an artist, he's been working for a long time, and also along the same time as Taro Okamoto. But he has a rather unique style, and the art trend can be viewed, it's tested and indicated with this unique perspective. So the subtitle here is to reread post-war art. So this is how I have been working, and from here, perhaps I can entertain your questions. Thank you very much. Well, relationship with previous work and documents were explained, and it was very interesting to hear. So what I want to ask you, Chiba-san, is a deviation of history of unborn art, so it is not exactly the mainstream orthodox. And then there's also this bad place where there's no structuring. So in comparison, this book of modern and contemporary art in Japan describes everything. So I think there's a big difference between Chiba-san and Sawaragi-san, and this is now being translated so that it's going to be read by English readers broadly. What do you think about that? Yes. Well, it could be called a domestic perspective, this big, huge volume. In other words, the relationship with the overseas, it's taken up in my chapter. And how did the institution of art in Japan develop? I was trying to track that. And I talked about the hijikata earlier. And for people who know about overseas quite well, Japanese art is a transplant of the European art, and this sapling has been put into another soil. And how did it grow? That might be one image. Shigeo Chiba studied at Paris University, and with regards to French art, Well, if you base yourself on French art and look at Japanese art, then institutions and discourse is not complete, and it's different from French art. Of course, I think it's good that it's different. So it's not born yet. So you have art as a kind of a category, and you cannot call it art, but why don't we deem it to be art for now? That kind of view. And maybe I shouldn't call it negative view, but you have, compared to the mainstream European art, it's a different position. And that position could be called this bad place, according to Sawaragi. It's different from Europe. And so that's what he meant when he said this bad place. But for example, Asia, or if you compare with Bangladesh, is Japan a bad place? Once you start to question this, I would say that kind of discourse could be seen differently. And earlier, as said from Nakajima-san, the defeat of the war as trauma, and this trauma could go towards new art. It was the energy to move towards new art. And even if you don't get money from the market, or you're not praised by someone, your uniqueness can be passed on. And I think that was a key motive. So it may look like a bad place, but actually it is a place that deserves respect, because you have this trauma of war, and each individual came up with a new worldview, and they tried to change this world. And I was very moved by this aspiration, and I think that was the reason why I have continued to do this work. Thank you very much. It's true that you have discussions of the previous works, and then in Japan, how did the institutions grow? And Nakajima-san, would you like to add? Yes. What I wanted to ask you today, well, one of the questions I wanted to ask is that you have the theory of institutions in Japan, and Mitsuda-san, you have various views on this. I could understand that. And close to the artwork, well, you've been close to the artwork, so that the artwork has to be handled in the end. And I think in terms of the way of thinking, maybe that's not the most important, but the defeat of the war was the energy to start post-war art. If you think in that way, then within the historical development in Japan, there could be art that comes into being, and through having a unique history, you had the art which was centered in US and Europe, but you could criticize that from the Japanese perspective. And this book, I think, created a space where that would be possible. Is that your feel? I'm sorry, I think I went off track somewhat. And when we talk about institutions, there is the art that was transplanted into Japan, and with institution and discourse, how did it change, and how did it take root? I think you can describe that. And for example, artwork catalogs could be viewed by overseas researchers and imagine certain things, but actually there are differences in the background. So it's possible to indicate this kind of a domestic perspective. And I think that would lend more depth to people's perspective, and also this kind of depth. Without thinking too much about it, you could say that it looks similar, so maybe such and such is pop art, or maybe such and such is liminal art. I don't negate making such a grouping, but you have to think about what is in the background, institutions, and discourse. And by describing that, I think this role to indicate what is in the background should exist. And what's born from that, I don't know if it can lead to critiques, but it could be a different value set, something that would make people think. I would want to see that. And also, I don't know if we can call that Japanese art very simply, but I think that there are the wonderful materials that will allow you to call it Japanese art. And in the 21st century, how effective is this way of thinking? I'm not quite sure myself. Earlier, you talked about the history of art in one country. Does it hold true as the history of art of a country? Mitsuda-san talked about domestic validation alone, not being able to explain things. And after the 60s, Japanese artists did go in great numbers to Europe and the West. And so I think in that sense too that the description is not yet completed. Yes, you have the domestic portion, and if you view that positively, as Nakajima-san said, you have the Western-centric history of post-war and modern art, but there could be some different introductions, which is seen in this book. That is the anarchy of the body. Kuroda-san is also touching on this in Japanese and in English. The performance history was not quite visible, but that's now included. But as Nakajima-san said, there's still much to do that's left, and probably by translating this into English, more research could be born. So the Agency for Cultural Affairs and Ishibashi Foundation we couldn't have this English version out without their support. The borders of art is expanding and I think fluctuating, but the cultural support of a state, and we're talking about institutions, should not be belittled because it's very important. For example, the Venice Biennale, they are talking about abolishing the country-based exhibits, but it's because it doesn't hold anymore. You have to have support of culture by the state so that international exhibitions can be held. So I don't know how things will change going forward, but I think it could perhaps be shown in a different way.
And thank you for emphasizing the meaning and the importance of this project. For my part, on a slightly different angle from introducing this book, I have got a question for Mitsuda-san, Professor Mitsuda. When you authored this chapter, you're looking at the women artists. You mentioned them to have been overlooked and excluded from the history of Japanese art. How do you regard the work of the women artists? Very highly, in fact. That's what I'm trying to do. I empathize with them tremendously, but the number of those who continued to be art makers until the very end was very limited. Only the winners, only the victorious were able to continue to do that. There are some tremendous number of women artists who had to discontinue art making or production because of the work or whatever. And I'm also interested in the debate, which is not going to be simple at all, about whether the degree of importance or meaning in identifying women artists as a category to be featured in exhibitions. You are studying that, aren't you? Leaving myself aside for the moment, it's not so much women artists as the context in which women artists have been handled or discussed, and how it depends on how male-centric the society is. Of course, there's no occasion when the women artists are going to be speaking out with one voice, but in very famous art museums, you always have kusama-yayoi, and there are many women artists who are studying abroad or working abroad. And these people are not fully acknowledged or appreciated, perhaps in the context of Japanese modern and contemporary art. True. And well, there is a way to look at Japanese history via the groups and the isms like monoha or gutai, but I think there are other ways of looking at evolution, and it's also probably going to be very much needed in the future. This book also looks at discourses and the internal gaze, navel gazing almost. The authors of criticism who might be doing a critique of an American artist, in most cases never in his or her wildest dreams, imagines that the American artist is going to be reading that piece of criticism. It's very limited in outlook or in imagination, and we can see scattered examples of that. Bijutsu Hihyo was a very influential magazine in the 1950s. That's also part of your research, Professor Mitsuda. And the way in which the discourse surrounding art was extremely distinctive. Back in the 50s, it's often described as the age of critics. And I think that the degree of attention that you focus on this is quite different from the usual overviews of art. Questions, perhaps? There are no questions so far from the YouTube audience. If you have any, please raise them. Kajiya-san, Professor Kajiya? My name is Kuresawa. Thank you very much indeed. Concerning this translation, Professor Kajiya spoke to us about the end of 2000, I think. And I never imagined this was going to happen. When I read the email, I was flabbergasted. There's no reason to reject it. It was a great honor. So we responded immediately. But after that, I started to wonder whether I had given the right response or not. Because you see, people often say that there is no overview of history of post-war art. there's no canon about that. Because Chiba-san and Saragi were both looking at the unorthodox, the bits that are left over. And with the Agency for Cultural Affairs, how this book is going to be received in 5 years or 10 years' time is something that gave us pause for thought and made us feel rather nervous. Because with the Agency for Cultural Affairs, you have that authentication, as it were. Now, I was involved. If you read the afterword, Morikoki summarizes how this book was put together. And I became involved at a later stage, very much a late stage, in fact. So by the time I was a part of this project, there wasn't that much wriggle room. And I was simply asked to do something about the 1990s. And that was a mission that I was asked to discharge. Now, the title shows you that most of the 25 authors are in fact historians. Mitsuda-san, for example. But I am not a historian. I'm looking at more recent times. That is what I've been doing journalistic work about and I've been writing about. So whether it is going to withstand the demands in 5 or 10 years' time, but you can only ever do work as an extension or extrapolation of what you've done up to now. So the institutions, discourse, and also practice, based on the basic frameworks that you've already referenced, how we put that in line with the way in which museums are being run, and what kind of work the critics have been doing. As for art making, what kind of art, and also what kind of response. If you could have an overview, I thought that that would give us the required amount of being not personally involved. And I think that I have been able to focus on keeping the discussion within the territory of Japan, because if we get beyond that, it was going to be unimaginable. But concerning this, I think I would be correct in saying that we have outstanding coverage in terms of diversity, but when it comes to the actual worth of this, I'm always going to have my own personal bias, though I'm trying not to avoid that. But that is something that future readers will have to gauge. That's it from me. Thank you, Mr. Kuresawa, who is the author of chapter 9, which I think was very difficult because he was writing about an ongoing situation. As you can see, when you read it, it really covers a tremendous range, and it's an outstanding piece of work. Now, as you've heard, this is an overview. It gives the chronology and history. As for the Agency for Cultural Affairs, we've had an extremely vigorous debate within the working group. And as Nakajima-san has already mentioned, there might have been different ways or different takes on history when you look at this book and the translation, but that is one of the end results of this view. But I do not believe that this book is a canon, and I do not even believe that canon itself exists in the sense of orthodox historical evolution. I think it's something which has been born within the aftermath of World War II.
ちらでご質問の手が上がっておりますので。
There's a hand up over there. I'm not involved in academia or anything, but I was able to have a discussion with Professor Kajiya once. I haven't read this book yet, but the fact that this book has been published and the fact it's been translated into English is a very big contribution. There probably are many points that you want to discuss or debate. But if I would guess that there are still areas that have not been fully addressed, and I just think that people should add and write and cover the bits which have been skipped over. And I just hope that this is going to be shared across the world, because we don't have anything that you can depend upon as basic reference material. Professor Kajiya, I know very well indeed, has been able to publish a book via MoMA, which is a very historic achievement, but this book, other books being translated into English, I know that there are many bottlenecks, such as time and also money, but there is so much that we have not been able to provide. And I think it's just a magnificent chance. Also, it is an Agency for Cultural Affairs project, but it is not authenticated or given the stamp of approval by the agency. Right. Kajiya-san. Well, it's true that there are ways to write about post-war Japanese art. This book itself is really outstanding, and I refer to it continuously. But I think and I hope that new studies are going to be published, and I think that's going to really be improving the situation even more.
Let me say something. So this is a very fundamental work, as you can see by reading it, and it covers the perspectives from each writer, and also you may agree, disagree, or you may be inspired and go into a variety of different directions. Thank you very much for many interesting comments. And since the publication, it's been, well, according to what I was told, it's been 8 years. And I think it's already out of sales. And it's available in English, but no longer in Japanese. What about it? What do you think? But this English version is now available. Maybe this will be a trigger for somebody to write about the history of art, or somebody to study history of art in Japan. Thank you very much to all of you. And with this, we would like to close the first half about the introduction of the modern and contemporary art of Japan.
So this is Hiroki Yamamoto speaking, and I study culture, and at the outset, with regards to anarchy of the body, that is I'd like to give a brief introduction of the anarchy of the body, undercurrents of performance art in 1960s Japan. It's shortened and called Niku Ana in Japan. And we have the author, Kuroda Raiji, and I would like to talk about the performance art history in the 1960s. And it is a huge volume, and as you can see, it is a very big book, very big volume. And most of the performance was held outside, and it really punished the body to its limits in terms of the practice. You were engaged in risk and sometimes risking your own life. Kuroda Raiji had used a huge amount of materials and testimony, and he tried to show the situation of the times and the target of the struggle, which is in the background. And at the time, there were authors, artists, and artistic groups that were not known, and a lot of new materials were incorporated into the book. And therefore, this book in the study of Japanese art history left an unprecedented track record. And this time we have the author, Kuroda Raiji Kuroda, with us today. And we're going together with Odate-san. She also spoke in session 1, and she must be tired having to spend the entire afternoon on stage. But that is a brief introduction, and somehow I would like to end on time, although Mr. Kuroda is a very big, very eloquent speaker. And having said that, I would like to ask him the first question. And this anarchy of the body, as I said, is very dense in terms of content and volume. And so I'd like to ask about the motive of writing the book and the process of writing the book. And also, from your perspective, what was the response of Japanese readers, including the researchers?
Thank you for the introduction. Mitsuda-san and the other speakers just mentioned this, but we'd never imagined or never even had any hope that there'd be a translation of this book. I mean, Anarchy of the Body it's probably going to be something that a lot of people are going to be complaining about, but a national organization was willing to put all these people together and provide a tremendous amount of money to make it possible to have a translation, which is all the more reason why the Agency for Cultural Affairs and our platform Japan, and also of course the translators, the proofreaders, all the copy editors, all those people who were part of this project. I mean, to respond to this, I didn't want to talk about this, but Mitsuda-san has already mentioned this, so I have to pick up on that. In short, I want to do something that you couldn't do in museums. It's like what they were discussing earlier. The catalogs published by museums are either sold out, or or it's difficult to obtain, or they have a whole mountain load of stuff which remains unsold, and they're hiding that. That's something that you can find in every single museum. But when I was working with a museum, the Kyushu-ha, the Kyushu School, which appear in Part 3, is something that I was able to organize an exhibition about that. Also, I did the Neo-Dada photography exhibition, which was a photographic record of exhibitions which did not contain a single photograph. Also, Shudan Kamen. This was archival material. And I was able to get some funding or a grant, but I was able to do some writing about that. And then Grand Books approached me with this idea of putting a book together. It isn't something that I worked actively to realize. Usually I don't have a thought in my head. I was asked if I could do something, then I began to think that I could do something, I could write about this. So I wrote this outline and sent it to Kurokawa Noriyuki. And his response was absolute bliss. So I thought I had something that looked promising. But I'm taking up too much of your time, I know, but the Neo-Dada, Kasakura Shoji, for example, was still around, and I asked him to do a performance, and he whiplashed a grand piano and simply dismantled it. And the grand piano was obtained by a person who later became the deputy mayor of Fukuoka City. And those performances were really fun. I mean, performances tend to be really boring. Don't you agree? You tend to lose your attention. And when you look at the films, then even worse, you just speed up and then you can no longer remember what you've seen. But Kasakura's performance was, it's avant-garde, it was violent, but it was performative. It was something that was really marvelous to see as a performance. It was something that you enjoyed watching. And the next slide, sorry. Around that time, I read this book. It's in Korean, and this is the first book that I was able to finish, which is completely read in Korean. I did skip from bits and pieces, but 1960s informel, 1970s Tansekwa are the two periods that people tend to write about, and then they just ignore the bits in the middle. So what this book did was it wrote about the bits in the middle, which people tend to ignore. And it was so fascinating that I wanted to write a book like this. And I remember stating that to Kurokawa-san, who was the editor, who approached me. That is my response so far to the question.
Sorry, I think the speaker is not using the microphone. Sorry. So I am involved in translating art and engagement, and there's a question to Kuroda-san and the Kyushu-ha. And as you said, it's in groups, or you bring things from the garbage dump, and there are things that aren't recorded. And so Kuroda-san wanted to record this so that people would view it in later generations, in other words, to leave for the next generation. And of course, there are external factors, but in order to do this, it shouldn't just be because you were told to do so. In other words, not just to say nice things, but there should be an internal motive.
Well, if I talk about that, it's going to be the end of discussion, but we're just going to give you the punchline. But if that's okay with you, if you're okay with that, rather, I could do that. But this book by Kim Mi-hong, I think it went up to the 70s. So it's before Chon Do-hwang, it's under Park Chung-hee. So freedom of expression is something that was really unimaginable. I mean, people weren't just arrested, they actually tortured them. That went on for ages, by the way, but that is a background where people actually tried to do avant-garde art, including performing or intervening in public roads. And so it's modernism as resistance, or resistance modernism. And I was thinking whether this could possibly exist in art history. I want to discover this. I want to look for that. But as I say in the afterword, I hadn't a single thought in my behind. Before I wrote it, I was thinking about stuff when I was writing it. I did not hope to keep something in records of something or anything.
With regards to the response in Japan, I think next slide or yes, this one. You have two names, that is Sawaragi Noi and Yoshitaka Mori, and they have cultural studies and adjacent areas. So you were saying that you were joyed by their response. So what was it that made you happy in terms of their response? If you could talk about the response in Japan.
Well, as you can see, they're not regular book reviews. They're from the culture page, and it's pretty big as an article. So even in looking at this in the context of an art article, it was given a lot of column inches, and Sawaragi-san really is a stylish writer, and what he wrote sounded so good. And when this was delivered to the house, some people thought that there was a DVD box set because it was so massive. But the editor wanted to create a black box, and so Sawaragi describes this as Pandora's box, where all the ills of the earth are going to be bursting out from the box when you open it, which I thought was very impressive. But at the very end, what he says, the need to start running from the past to the future, is something which sounded so incredibly good. And being able to write about that with this short article was extremely rewarding for the editor as well. Professor Mori is a cultural studies expert, so he writes about class struggle, and it's not just about Tokyo and the center or the rural areas. It really relates to what Shinohara Ushio said. And to go further into that, there are classes, hierarchy in terms of John, and also the social hierarchy, which I think there was a desire to overturn that somewhere, because contemporary art has become this rarefied field where you just have the super elite. And people are being invited to go abroad, which has nothing to do with the reality of Japan. I describe them as dilettantes, and this really mundane reality, which is full of complications and paradoxes, is something that I hope and I want to see more of. And that is a point that Professor Mori picked up on. And Nishihon Shimbun is published just in Fukuoka, nowhere else, and read nowhere. But I thought it was a pity to waste such a great article on that very limited readership, and I shouldn't have introduced them.
So Mori-san's interest in cultural studies, I think there are a lot of points that I could understand. And from your perspective, Kuroda-san, and to go a bit forward, there's the concept of liminal art, and I think it's being perceived as such. And so how do you view this perspective?
Well, liminal art is something that I had a response that I'd not expected. But Fukusimi Ren has written about this topic. I've actually quoted from that. So Fukusumi-san, you can understand as somebody who'd be really talking about Genkai Geijutsu or liminal art. Mail art, as in Ito Kanji's case, or the haiku. That is, he creates the collage work. All of those can be described as liminal art practices. And when you expand on that, then, for example, you have Matsuzawa Yutaka. He had a major retrospective last year. But the things that they've been doing, also Mizukami Jun, mentioned in Anarchy of the Body, all those people can be classified as liminal art. When you come to that, conceptual art seems to be something that is much closer to us and is not necessarily an import from abroad. When you expand on that perspective, whether it's high art or popular art, everything can be falling within the frame of liminal art, and perhaps the hierarchy of art could be dismantled or begin to disintegrate. Capitalistic art or non-capitalistic art is something that Fukusimi Ren has been arguing about, where art becomes completely separate from capitalism and the structure. If that is part of liminal art, then it will become art which has been able to escape from capitalism, which is truly revolutionary. Though I didn't actually think about that when I was writing the book, I began to think about those possibilities after completing the book. But having somebody who could read this from the book is reassuring.
Saruki-san and Mori-san, they are the central players in discourse in post-war art, or maybe a bit outside it. And so this hierarchy in art, maybe that's relevant. Post-war art, the main part or mainstream of post-war art. What about the response? In other words, overturning the hierarchy and the response to your questioning the hierarchy, or was it ignored?
You know, I've given you the punchline, the conclusion first, so, well, here's the next slide. I stumbled over this by sheer accident, and I thought it probably was going to be the best explanation. Makes my job easier. And a certain professor said that work that could be ignored or not preserved or not even leaves a trace was regarded as something which is disposable, could be discarded. And a lot of people probably think this way, though we never hear their voices. But it's possible that a specific community or circle might be ignoring this stuff. And I think that art museums and art criticism figures are doing what I've been involved with tends to be the sort of things that art museums or critics would tend to regard as beneath their attention. They don't think it's and a lot of that, what I'm dealing with, would be regarded as simply not worthy of any attention, that should be discarded. And I don't care. I think it's just fun to see what happens and just leaving them to do what they want to do. You know about Yoshida Sensha, the cartoonist? He does Puri Puri Ken.
Next slide, please. Well, in a sense, you have national hierarchy in Japan, and the English version layout with regards to the photos, the hierarchy is somewhat upturned. And I think, Kuroda-san, you said that it was interesting and you sent me the slide. So can you talk about this slide?
Well, translation is something you can discuss afterwards, but however, the layout, I didn't give any instructions. I asked if they could try to respect the Japanese layout as far as possible. So the frontispieces, all of those, the plates, as far as possible, have been in the same way, laid out in the same way as with the Japanese version. And with the designer, I think that this is. I should also mention that 1965 is a rather questionable attribution. Anyway, what they did in Zerojigin was they wrapped a naked woman, and all these people who dressed formally took a train. So it looks as if though all these men had simply decided to take a woman somewhere who'd been trying to escape from them. So we were very furious. But this, and of course, High Red Center, I think you've seen this photograph many occasions. In the Japanese version, this was put on a completely different page. However, now that Zero-Jigen and High Red Center are put together on the same page with a vertical relationship and cropped to the same size, has this combination or juxtaposition rather of a rather unknown performance piece with a very famous performance piece. And there are a number of other examples like this. Buying both Japanese and the English versions would be rather expensive, but I think this gives you some idea of what's been happening with the plates, the illustrations. Depends on the philosophy and the thought, and that's part of one of the things which are interesting about the English version.
Next slide. I think this is a very important part of the middle of this talk, so I want to show it. And it says the word anarchism and how it sounds in Japanese. And the reason why you chose anarchism in the title, and if you could explain that.
I love thinking up titles. And I've often named my books like Beyond the Anti-Art, which it doesn't give you the same ring of glamour that you get with the Japanese version, which is Hangei-jutsu no Kanatae. With Anarchy of the Body, anarchism by the way, the Japanese version gives the pronunciation of anarchism as anarchism, which is different. There was this Shinsho library edition which came out about anarchism, and it had a fantastic bibliography. And it starts with John Lennon's Imagine, and then it went on to talk about the anime film Captain Harlock, and Matsumoto Leiji has just died. But then I thought this seemed to be just right, which is why I thought about anarchism. But this slide shows you that pink thing says no air transport or air freight. It's because somebody wrote the title, the full title, Anarchy of the Body, and then apparently this was considered to be inappropriate for air freight. The reason which was given is the name and description of the item. And we really love that, because this is something that I really want to share with you. Don't you think it's funny? Because there's so much that you could really poke holes into. I mean, is it okay for this to be transported by truck or lorry or train? Though it's not supposed to be transported by air freight? And I mean, it's just this. And the Agency for Cultural Affairs and the national government providing money to put this into English for stuff like that?
It's okay. And now I'd like to go into the second question. My first question was rather long. So there is the positioning in the regular art history, but my second question, the anarchy of the body in the modern and contemporary art history discourse in Japan, how do you position your book in this discourse?
Well, one thing which goes back to my big opening statement is Mitsuda-san spoke about the exhibitions focusing on post-war art held in museums, and you can do that through exhibitions discussing history, but that doesn't seem to be enough. Just lining up what happened to exist in the past with illustrations, going beyond that is something that I wanted to do. And of course, it's like the discourses, which is mentioned repeatedly in the previous session. And there's also the issue of hihyo versus hihan, because they could both be criticism. But hihyo, which is the spirit of being critical, is something that needs to happen. And you know, the discourse within the limits of the art world is really boring. It's not interesting. And I think the people who wrote that book, which is mentioned in chapter 1, Discourse, is not related to society or to economics or whatever, but the discourse tends to be self-contained within art circles. In the 1960s, you had artists who were incredibly popular, who were considered to be very important. Takamatsujiro, for example, is somebody that I really have no interest whatsoever in. The Mitsuda-san has actually written a book about him, because he's somebody that a lot of people have been writing about, so I didn't done that. Looking at Gutai, Gutai has been studied. Kunimatsu-san, a lot of people have been doing work on that, them. Nakajima-san as well. And that has given a lot of rewarding work to read about. But this also remains within the art circles. I think that for me, art activities, art making, I mean, Hannah Arendt is somebody I could try to imitate. Work, labor, and activity. Am I right? It's activity, it's not work or a job. That's the level that artists have been doing. And then there's been the direction that people have been developing or exploring. And within the limits of what is possible in any given period of time, I think that I'm really bad at this sort of theory-based argument, but one is reminded of Osugi Sakae, the anarchist. And I need something like that which to spark my interest. And right now, I'm basically not interested anymore in contemporary art. I've been visiting zoos all the time.
Some irregular expressions. In other words, energy. We go back to the starting point of energy. Now, I'd like to talk about your English version. I think it's 2 slides forward. What I want to ask you, next slide, please. So, in the translation into English, well, translation into other language structures, it's not just substituting words. There are a lot of difficulties, and I think that you very carefully checked the English version in a short period of time, and I think I should thank you here. And in terms of the English translation, what were you especially careful of? What was especially difficult? If you could talk about your experience of checking the translation.
When we look at the Shuzo database, there was a translation of the Paris downtown or the Paris working class quarters, and the translation was just Paris, which I simply found unforgivable. Shitamachi is a loaded term. It isn't quite downtown. It's really like the people who are not upper class, who live in this given area. But looking at the translation project, I was given a number of proposals, but about translators, but just putting this into readable English wasn't going to reflect the depth or the richness of the Japanese. It's like what Natsume has said. Natsume Soseki pointed out the importance of having those complexions and those inflections which are going to remain, and I was very insistent about this. And when people who are really good at writing English did their own thing, sometimes the English version was really good, but sometimes it went too far and was too extreme, that it seemed to be jeering or making fun of the artists. So I would write down that I didn't want that happening. And then the translator would be saying that the translator had no intention of ridiculing these artists, but I asked them to do some corrections and rewriting. The style guides, fantastic. It really made our job much easier, but there are a number of issues that remained outstanding. Mitsuda-san spoke about the Jiken Kobo archive, but it all had experimental workshop as the English version. But we decided to put the group as Jiken Kobo. There was an interaction with the translator, and Jiken Kobo, it's already a Wikipedia entry. Also, experimental workshop sounds generic. It doesn't sound like a personal or an actual name for a group. Gutai is Gutai. Nobody talks about this concrete. Zero jigen is zero jigen, not zero dimension. So it's a transliteration in most cases. However, Hanzai Shadome, which hardly anybody has ever heard of, I really loved the ring of League of Criminals because I felt this sounded so much more cool and stylish, which shows you that I have absolutely no ability to keep things straight and have the same style apply. But the style guide did not go that far. Also, all that San was mentioning, proofreading, after layout, the proofreading was done by myself and the Agency for Cultural Affairs team, which gave us a year of absolute awfulness. It was incredibly difficult because I didn't have the ability to sign off on anything. For example, the Asahi Graph, Asahi Journal, we decided to have the transliteration, just reproducing the Japanese pronunciation. This is all such technical detail that you're probably not interested in, but Asahi Graph, Mainichi Graphic, Mainichi Graph, Asahi Picture News. You know, when you look at all the actual original copies, you can no longer decide what's right. So what we did was to choose Asahi Graph, which is the Romaji representation of the Japanese pronunciation, or the Japanese name. Hanzaisha Dome, I just felt that this was a name that I couldn't afford to leave out, and the next person was going to do something more.
So the English translation version is completed. That means that it's in English, so that, well, other languages perhaps should be considered, but now you can have dialogue with countries outside Japan, and there is dissemination purpose, but not just dissemination. You want to have mutual dialogue or cross-fertilization so that both sides can benefit. So with this English translation book, there will be more dialogue, and I think in terms of Japanese art and Asian art research, what are your expectations, things that you'd like to see happen? Of course, if you say there aren't any, then that will be it.
Don't mind if we just end this discussion right now, but just say, nah, I've got nothing that I hope for.
Okay, so there's no more time, but there's going to be the revised version of the Anarchy of the Body, and you wanted to talk about that, and it's going to be coming out soon, this Japanese revised version of Anarchy of the Body. So what's been added? So if you could talk about the revised version.
There's going to be the expanded and updated version, which already has been announced on the publisher's website by the end of this year. You knew this is really embarrassing, though I asked if I could have some time to do this plug. But the editor is going to be Kurokawa-san once again. So it all depends on what's convenient for him and for me. But the thing is that the bibliography remained incomplete in the Japanese version because he was tired out, I was worn out, and we just decided that we couldn't do any more work on this. We're going to put in a bibliography. Also, the English version, the editor was like a miracle worker because the bibliography is put together just by looking at the footnotes. I have absolutely no idea how they managed to do that and how they could have the time and energy to do that. The thing is that the English version has the bibliography, but the Japanese version doesn't. So we're going to be putting that in. But whatever we do, there is so much that needs to be done. There are 1,900 specific pieces of specific publications, as far as I recall, and I think I'm going to shove this over onto the editor's side. And it's more than a decade since we did this, so there need to be corrections and updates. But the main thing is the bibliography. Also, it's going to be bound better, because if you read this properly, the book falls to pieces in your hands. A lot of people had the problem, so we're going to improve on the binding. It's going to be sturdier. And of course, the errata that we picked up in the process of translation are going to be reflected in the updated version. So it's going to be more accurate and more rewarding. It'd be fantastic if we could invest in the second copy.
So it's now 6 p.m. and we've received some questions in advance. I can't take up all the questions, but I've tried to pick up some questions, and also Odate-san can ask some questions or make comments, and then those people in the floor and people listening in the YouTube could ask questions. It's quite timely that after COVID-19, physical contact is avoided more than before right now. And so how is anarchy of the body possible? That's the question that we received in advance. So how would you like to answer?
Impossible. Over and out. Could I have the slides? Thank you. Well, the discuss of physical contact is not something that started with the COVID-19. It's always been around for quite a while before that. Japanese youth no longer seem to be interested in studying abroad. And the Chinese and Koreans are roaming the entire world. But that phenomenon is not just applicable to the younger generation. Again, looking at Dubuffet, if you do a search about libraries, people believe that you can have everything that has been thought in the past in your hand. And there's no consideration for the fact that what you have has already been pre-selected and cleansed. I think this really is a very opposite point. I've met a number of people who are like that, who believe that you can find out about everything that they need to find out about on the net. But they say you don't need to, there's no need to introduce Asian art, but they never say the same thing about American art. It's because they look down on Asian art. At the same time, young people go to countries in Asia, for example, and they build up relationships with local people. But there are these people who believe that they have this perfect relationship with the internet, their family members and their friends. And a lot of people are like that in contemporary art. But once in a while you do look at that, but I don't have that sort of hope or expectation anymore, but English has a horrendous ability to spread around the world. One of the offers I got was to have a Korean version. There's also Polish as an opportunity. They were just chatting about that, but Korean is a language that I can read to some extent. But even in Japanese, there's no international spread. Korean is also difficult, but with English, you can have all these unimaginable people who might be reading stuff. Good books, somebody said in a newspaper article, are the sort of books that you can't really shelve properly and you can't really pinpoint into one category. So Anarchy of the Body and what kind of people could read it is something that I'm looking forward to finding out more about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the following two slides could be a kind of a conclusion. And when I was a PhD student, the last slide was shown first, a mistake, but not today. But I think these are the final two slides. Do you want to talk about it?
Well, expectation, hopes. It's not so much that as a book. This is a book that I discovered quite recently. This text and also this visual. It's about discourse. You need to take up discourse which is not dependent on pre-existing history, about trying to make hierarchy into something fluid. Asai Masuo has written about that kind of thing with Andromeda, and you can find out more if you do a search, because next. You know, thank you so much for your attention, is what I can say to the audience here, but I have no idea what the web audience is doing.
We're not finished yet, Odate-san. Before we open up to the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Kuroda, and also Mr. Yamamoto for the wonderful moderating. So this book, this very important book, is actually quite encouraging to the artists at work. Encouraging, inspiring, and what they are doing is that they are making as much resistance activities as possible, little by little. And so I believe that in this situation, if they want to continue what they are doing in terms of resistance activities, then what do they need?
Well, it comes down to the definition of art, exactly what is art. But you know, regular politicians, social activists, and scientists, or medical personnel, environmental activists, would never ever dream or think or imagine of doing this kind of stuff. That's the sort of thing which is fully describable as art activity and which is meaningful. Because if it's something that can be thought up by those other people, then it's something that only that companies could shoulder or do. So doing what is only doable by these people, you ask yourself continuously whether they're doing that or not. That's what I hope to see.
Thank you very much. So I think we have artists in the floor who feel very much encouraged by what you say. We have only 7 minutes left or so, and I would like to take questions from the floor. Also, we don't have questions from YouTube participants yet, but are there any questions that you would like to ask Kuroda-san? Anything? Any questions to Kuroda-san? If not, Kuroda-san and myself, we can continue our discussion. Is that okay? Now, if Kuroda-san doesn't mind, I'd like to talk about the dialogue that will be born out of this English translation publication. In other words, what kind of mutual dialogue do you expect, or what are your wishes with that publication, or what changes do you see, or what direction do you want to go in?
Dismantling the hierarchy, if we're going to talk about that, Japan and the West, or Europe and the States, not putting them into contrast, but looking at Europe and the United States as a reference point, Korea, Taiwan, China, the non-Euro-American world could also be compared, and we could do that via English as the medium. Saragi Noi's book about contemporary Japanese art has been translated into Korean. Chiba Shigeo, I think, has also. I think somebody wanted to put out a Chinese version. I don't know whether it's been published or not, but China, Korea, and Japan, I hope are going to be doing work in that way. But English could act as a medium or the go-between for Australia, South America, Latin America, Brazil, or wherever. And I hope that would be lovely to see.
Yes, in the translation project or other events, it shouldn't just be English, Asian language. I think that going forward, if we could partially introduce that, that would be good. And you see some examples here. That is Korean popular art or taring padi in Indonesia. So Asian art via English, I think that we could have the third or fourth or fifth publication so that we can have more dialogue and do more evaluations. That is my strong feeling.
Well, Kataoka-san is here, and I'm now trying to curry favors with her, but great present at Mori Art Museum. I'm not just saying this just because she's here. It looked at Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and also Hong Kong being shown in the same timeline, and I think it was extremely important work. And there was a proper publication as well, doing a documentation and history. And I just wish other people would do more of that kind of thing.
Thank you very much. And at the end, if there is anything from the floor, we have 2 minutes or so left. If there are no questions, we can wrap up. Anyone? Final question or comment that you may have? No? Okay, then. Well, I think later on you can ask him directly. And I think that the translators and secretariat and Kuroda-san, I think everyone had a lot of effort. And thank you so much. We're glad for the publication, and we hope that it will be read extensively. Thank you very much, Kuroda-san. So we can wrap up here.
I'm meant to stop making lame jokes, but my apologies for behaving this way.
Well, we have 1 minute and 30 seconds. You can say whatever you have left.
Well, hierarchy in art and society. This slide could take me 1 hour easily. But this is about art and culture, about the hierarchy and the social structure. This is a part, and also it's not two-dimensional. You have these horizontal lines which crisscross against this. So a lot of this is the virtual sphere, It's basically about how capitalism and everything are in this balance. This is done by Kuroda Raiji, but the description transliteration is weird.
So with this slide, I think it's exactly 6:15.
I'm sorry. I apologize for doing such a lame ending.
So thank you to all the speakers. We would like to close this session here.